You take a gallon of water and pour it onto a parched garden bed, watching the soil turn dark and rich. It feels like an act of life, but in the eyes of physics, you've just committed a massive waste of resources. The very way we've been taught to water our plants, the simple act of pouring from above, is arguably the most inefficient method ever devised. Most of that water will never touch a root. Instead, it will vanish into the air or suffocate the very ground it was meant to save. Imagine a farmer in the high desert, watching his crops wither while his irrigation ditches are bone dry. He's doing everything right by the book, yet the ground beneath him is turning into a brick. This isn't a story about a lack of water. It's a story about a fundamental misunderstanding of how earth and liquid interact. We treat soil like a sponge, but in reality, it behaves more like a complex, microscopic highway system. When you dump water on the surface, you're essentially creating a traffic jam at the entrance. But here, where it gets interesting. When water hits the surface of the soil all at once, a phenomenon called surface sealing occurs. The impact of the droplets breaks apart soil aggregates, creating a thin, muddy film that clogs the pores. Suddenly, the ground becomes hydrophobic. Instead of sinking down to the roots, the water sits on top, waiting for the sun to reclaim it. In a standard garden setting, up to 50% of your water can be lost to evaporation before it travels more than an inch deep. You aren't watering the plant, you're humidifying the neighborhood. Think about the last time you saw a puddle after a heavy rain. That water isn't there because the ground is full. It's there because the ground has shut down. It's a biological defensive mechanism that ends up starving the plant of oxygen. Because here's the kicker, roots need to breathe just as much as they need to drink. By flooding the surface, you're effectively drowning the soil's air pockets, creating an anaerobic dead zone where pathogens thrive and roots rot. That's not the full story, though. We've been conditioned to believe that more is better, but the plant's biology tells a different tale. When you water from the top, you encourage lazy roots. The moisture stays in the upper 2 inches of soil, so the roots stay there too, huddled near the surface. The moment a heat wave hits, those shallow roots bake and the plant collapses. To build a resilient plant, you have to force it to go deep. You have to stop chasing the surface and start targeting the dark. This brings us to a radical alternative that feels almost counterintuitive: subsurface irrigation. Instead of fighting the surface tension of the earth, we bypass it entirely. Imagine a network of porous pipes or simple ceramic vessels buried deep within the root zone. This isn't just a different tool, it's a different philosophy. It's called tension-based watering. In this system, the water isn't pushed into the soil, it's pulled. Through a process known as capillary action, the dry soil literally asks for moisture. When the ground is dry, it creates a vacuum-like tension that draws water out of the buried source. The moment the soil is perfectly hydrated, the tension stops and the water flow ceases. It's a self-regulating conversation between the earth and the reservoir. And this changes everything. Because the water is delivered 6 to 12 inches underground, evaporation drops to near zero. The surface of the soil remains dry, which sounds like a failure until you realize that weed seeds need a wet surface to germinate. By keeping the top layer parched, you've effectively deleted your weed problem without a single chemical. Meanwhile, down in the dark, the roots are sensing a deep, consistent moisture source. They dive downward, anchoring the plant and accessing minerals that surface dwellers could never reach. But why isn't everyone doing this? If it's so much better, why are we still standing in our yards with hoses every evening? The answer is a mix of tradition and the visible result trap. Humans love to see the work being done. We like seeing the soil turn dark. It gives us an immediate hit of dopamine that says, I have provided. Subsurface irrigation is invisible. You can't see it working, and for many, that feels like a lack of control. Furthermore, our entire industrial agricultural complex is built on top-down infrastructure pivot sprinklers and massive sprayers that are easy to install but devastatingly wasteful. It's a system designed for convenience, not for the biology of the planet. However, the results of switching are hard to ignore. In trials comparing surface flooding to subsurface tension systems, farmers have seen a 40% increase in yield while using 60% less water. It's the closest thing to a free lunch in environmental science. You're doing less work, using fewer resources, and getting a more robust result. So how do you actually apply this? It doesn't require a high-tech laboratory. It can be as simple as an olla, an unglazed terracotta pot buried in the ground. You fill the pot with water, cap it, and walk away. The porous clay acts as the membrane, letting water seep out only when the surrounding plants need it. It's a technology that's over 4,000 years old, yet it outperforms almost every smart sprinkler on the market today. We are living in an era where water is becoming our most precious currency. Continuing to pour it onto the surface of the dirt is like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. We've been focusing on the pour when we should have been focusing on the pull. The next time you look at a garden, don't look at the leaves or the damp surface. Look at the space beneath. That's where the real chemistry happens. The most profound changes often happen where no one is looking, silently beneath the surface. If we change the way we deliver life to the roots, we don't just save a garden, we might just save the ground itself. How much of what we consider common sense in our daily lives is actually just a habit that's holding us back? While the ancient olla represents the low-tech pinnacle of this philosophy, the modern world has taken the pull method into the digital age. We are now seeing the rise of biomimetic sensors devices that don't just measure moisture, but actually mimic the way a plant's root hairs interact with the soil. These sensors act as an artificial nervous system for the earth, telling us exactly when the soil's tension reaches a critical breaking point. But the shift goes deeper than just technology. It's a move toward precision hydration. Imagine a vineyard where every single vine receives a different amount of water based on the specific mineral composition of the square foot of earth it occupies. By using subsurface drip lines coupled with AI-driven flow controllers, we can create a microclimate for every individual plant. This isn't just about survival anymore, it's about optimization. In the wine industry, this level of control allows growers to induce controlled stress, forcing the vine to concentrate sugars in the grapes rather than wasting energy on excess leaf growth. This transition, however, requires us to confront the green grass paradox. For decades, a lush, emerald green lawn or field has been the universal signifier of health. But we now know that a bright green surface often hides a shallow, fragile ecosystem. True resilience is brown on top and thriving underneath. We have to retrain our eyes to value the invisible strength of the root zone over the superficial aesthetic of a wet surface. And this is where the global implication becomes clear. As urban centers expand and the climate shifts, the wasteful pour is no longer just a bad gardening habit, it's a systemic risk. If we can scale the pull method to industrial agriculture and city landscaping, we can theoretically double our food production without using a single extra drop of water. We are standing on the edge of a second green revolution, but this one won't be driven by chemicals or GMOs. It will be driven by our willingness to work with the physics of the soil rather than trying to overpower it. The logic is simple, but the execution requires a total reimagining of our relationship with the land. We have to stop treating the soil as a passive container and start treating it as a living, breathing partner. When you stop pouring and start providing, the earth responds with a vigor that no hose-end sprayer can ever match. The truth is hidden in plain sight, just a few inches below your feet. The question is no longer how much water we have, but how much we are willing to respect the way it moves. If we can master the art of the subsurface, we don't just grow better plants, we build a more resilient future. Are you ready to stop watering the air and start feeding the deep? The transition from a pouring culture to a precision culture doesn't just save water, it radically alters the chemistry of the food we eat. When you saturate the surface, you are essentially leaching nutrients. The downward force of heavy watering carries nitrogen and vital minerals deep past the root zone and into the groundwater, where they become pollutants instead of fuel. But when we utilize the pull of the soil, the nutrient cycle stays localized. The soil remains a concentrated bank of energy. This is why plants grown with subsurface tension methods often test higher for Brix, a measurement of sugar content and mineral density. We aren't just growing more efficiently, we are growing more nutritiously. The plant is no longer struggling against the cycle of flood and drought. It is living in a state of constant, perfect equilibrium. And this changes everything. This logic is now being applied to vertical forests and urban living walls in cities like Milan and Singapore. In these high-stakes environments, you cannot afford to have water dripping down the side of a skyscraper or evaporating into the urban heat island. These structures use synthetic, smart soils and capillary mats that act like a giant wick. The building itself becomes a biological sponge, pulling moisture upward against gravity, mimicking the vascular system of a literal tree. That's not the full story, though. The real barrier to this revolution isn't the cost of the pipes or the pots, it's the cost of our own attention. We have become disconnected from the rhythm of the earth. We want a timer to do the thinking for us, but the most advanced, smart controller in the world is still just a guess compared to the physical reality of a root hair seeking moisture. The hidden truth is that the technology to solve our water crisis has existed in the form of physics and clay for millennia. But here, where it gets interesting. As we look toward the possibility of life on other planets, the pouring method is the first thing we've discarded. In the low-gravity or controlled environments of space habitats, water is managed through membrane-based systems that rely entirely on surface tension and capillary pull. NASA isn't using sprinklers, they are using the exact same principles as the ancient Ola. If it's the only way to grow life in the void of space, why are we still using the worst way here on Earth? We are standing at a crossroads of common sense. The old way is a spectacle, a fountain of waste that makes us feel like providers while we actually starve the soil. The new way is a quiet, invisible partnership. It requires us to trust in what we cannot see and to respect the subtle forces that have governed plant life for millions of years. The true measure of a gardener or a civilization isn't how much water they can pour, but how little they can waste while still reaching the deep. The answers aren't falling from the sky. They are waiting for us to look down and listen to the pull of the earth. What other standard ways of living are actually just masks for massive inefficiency? The final piece of this puzzle isn't found in a pipe or a pot, but in the microscopic architecture of the soil itself. When we stop the cycle of pour and dry, we stop the physical destruction of the soil's pores. Think of the ground as a city of tiny tunnels. Every time you flood the surface, you're essentially sending a tidal wave through those tunnels, collapsing the homes of the very microbes that make the soil fertile. By switching to a subsurface pull system, we allow these tunnels to remain intact. The soil stays aerated, fluffy, and alive. This is the secret to carbon sequestration. Healthy, undisturbed soil can hold massive amounts of atmospheric carbon, but only if its structure isn't being constantly smashed by the weight of falling water and surface crusting. And this changes everything. We are no longer just talking about saving water, we are talking about healing the planet's skin. In the vast grasslands of Africa and the Americas, researchers are finding that mimicry is the key to restoration. They aren't just planting seeds, they are creating microdepressions and using buried moisture traps to jumpstart the Earth's natural capillary system. Once the pull is re-established, the land begins to heal itself. The plants return, the roots dive deep, and the water cycle stabilizes. But here, where the logic meets a hard reality. Transitioning a global agricultural system away from surface irrigation is a monumental task. It's expensive to dig, it's difficult to monitor, and it's hard to convince a world obsessed with quick fixes to invest in a system that takes time to show its true strength. We have built an entire economy on the pour, from the manufacturers of plastic sprinklers to the chemical companies that sell the fertilizers that wouldn't be necessary if we weren't leaching the soil dry. That's not the full story, though. The pressure is mounting. As aquifers drop to historic lows, the worst way to irrigate is becoming an unaffordable luxury. We are being forced to return to the wisdom of the Ola, updated with the precision of the sensor. We are learning that the most powerful thing we can do is step back and let the physics of the universe do the heavy lifting. When you look at a field or a garden now, you shouldn't see a landscape to be conquered with a hose. You should see a complex living battery that is waiting to be charged. The hidden truth was never about the water itself, it was about the delivery. It was about moving from a culture of dominance to a culture of resonance. The most effective systems in nature don't shout, they whisper. They don't flood, they seep. By aligning our technology with the quiet, persistent pull of the roots, we find a path to abundance that doesn't cost the earth. The future of life on this planet doesn't depend on how much more we can take, but on how much more we can understand about the silent world beneath our feet. If the most obvious way to water a plant is actually the most destructive, what other fundamental truths are we currently ignoring? Refining the deep. To truly master the pull, one must understand the specific tension of their local soil. Are you ready to dig deeper? The final barrier to this shift isn't physical, it's psychological. We have been raised to view the earth as a static floor, a platform that simply holds our plants up while we feed them. But once you realize that the soil is a living, breathing lung, the pouring method feels less like nourishment and more like suffocation. Every time we dump water on the surface, we are essentially sealing the pores of the planet. This leads to a phenomenon known as crusting, where the top layer of soil turns into a literal concrete-like barrier. Underneath this crust, the soil biology begins to starve. The oxygen-loving bacteria that create fertility die off, replaced by anaerobic microbes that produce toxic byproducts. And this changes everything. We aren't just losing water to the sky, we are losing the very vitality of the ground. But the pull method, the subsurface approach, acts as a continuous life support system. It maintains the sponge structure of the soil. When the soil remains porous, it can absorb more than just the water we provide. It becomes capable of drinking in the rain. A field managed with subsurface tension can absorb a flash flood that would wash away a traditional poured farm. This is the hidden logic behind the Great Green Wall in Africa and the restoration of the lowest plateau in China. They didn't just plant trees, they redesigned the way water enters the earth. They moved from a system of runoff to a system of infiltration. They stopped fighting gravity and started using it. That's not the full story, though. The economic pressure is now reaching a tipping point. As the cost of pumping groundwater rises and the availability of surface water shrinks, the worst way to irrigate is becoming a financial liability. We are seeing a massive migration towards smart drip and micro-waller systems in areas once thought to be lost to the desert. We are discovering that wasteland is often just mismanaged land. But here, where it gets interesting. This isn't just about the desert. This applies to your backyard, your local park, and the median strips on your commute. We are surrounded by thirsty, shallow-rooted landscapes that are one broken sprinkler head away from death. If we converted our urban green spaces to subsurface pull systems, we could reduce city water consumption by billions of gallons a year while simultaneously cooling our streets through more efficient transpiration. The transition is invisible, silent, and profound. It requires us to abandon the dopamine hit of the splashing hose and find satisfaction in the deep, thriving green of a plant that is drinking from the dark. It's a move toward a more mature relationship with our environment, one based on observation rather than force. We've spent centuries trying to bend the water to our will, pouring it wherever we see brown. But the real secret to abundance was always waiting in the tension of the dry earth, asking for just enough, at just the right depth. The future isn't about finding more water, it's about learning to trust the pull. When you look at your garden today, do you see a thirsty surface, or a living system waiting for a deeper connection? The silent revolution. The most powerful changes are the ones that happen where no one is looking. Is it time to change your perspective? The transition from the pour to the pull is the final bridge between our industrial past and a biological future. For a century, we've treated the surface of the earth like a factory floor, dumping, spraying, and saturating in a desperate bid for control. But the physics of the planet doesn't respond to force, it responds to flow. By bypassing the surface and engaging with the dark, silent tension of the root zone, we stop acting as masters of the soil and start acting as its partners. This is the ultimate hidden truth of the garden. The most visible act of care is often the most invisible act of destruction. We have spent generations chasing the aesthetic of the wet look, equating a dark, damp surface with success. In reality, that dampness is a signal of failure, of evaporation, of runoff, and of wasted potential. When we embrace the subsurface, we trade the theater of irrigation for the reality of resilience. We build plants that don't just survive the heat but thrive within it, anchored by roots that have been taught to seek the deep. And this changes everything. As we face a global landscape where water is no longer a given, but a luxury, the worst way to irrigate must be relegated to history. We have the tools, from the ancient clay vessel to the modern sensor, to rewrite our relationship with the land. The path forward isn't paved with more water, it's paved with more wisdom. It's a quiet revolution, happening 1 inch beneath the crust, transforming the way we feed ourselves and the world. The earth has been speaking to us through the physics of tension for millennia. It's finally time we stopped shouting over it with our hoses and started listening to the pull. True growth doesn't happen where the sun hits the water. It happens in the cool, dark spaces where the earth and the root meet in perfect balance. If the most fundamental act of gardening, watering, has been wrong for so long, what other obvious truths are waiting to be unlearned? The deep return. The surface is a mask. The strength is in the depth. How will you change the way you feed the world today?